The razor wire gleamed silver in the morning sun, coiled atop 30-foot concrete walls that stretched as far as the eye could see. Beyond those walls lay the quarantine zone, a vast territory of abandoned cities, roaming dead, and secrets that the World Recovery Council refused to discuss. Tavian Blackwood stood at the observation deck of Haven Station 7, his dark eyes fixed on the distant skyline where skyscrapers jutted like broken teeth from the Earth's wounded mouth. Somewhere in that forsaken wilderness lay the truth about the Moretti virus, and he intended to find it. "You're actually going through with this insanity," a voice said behind him. Tavian turned to see Esha Mari approaching, her lab coat billowing in the artificial wind from the ventilation systems. The brilliant virologist had been one of the first scientists to study the outbreak when it began 3 years ago, back when they still believed it could be contained. Her copper skin bore the permanent worry lines of someone who'd seen civilization collapse in real time. She carried a tablet displaying biometric data, charts that Tavian couldn't begin to understand but knew represented humanity's desperate attempt to make sense of the unthinkable. "Someone has to," Tavian replied, his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his gut. "The Council's reports don't add up. The infection rates, the mutation patterns, the way entire cities went dark within hours, none of it matches what they're telling us." Esh joined him at the railing, her expression grave. "I've been saying that for 2 years. They suspended my security clearance when I started asking the wrong questions." She pulled up a holographic projection from her tablet, showing a 3-dimensional map of the quarantine zone. Red clusters marked high-density infected areas, but one location pulsed with an ominous purple glow, the Moretti Research Campus, ground zero of the outbreak. "If you're really doing this, you need to reach the source." Everything started there. The sound of heavy boots announced the arrival of Marek Volkov, a former Russian Special Forces operative whose scarred face told 1,000 stories of survival. He carried a duffel bag that clinked with weapons and ammunition, his muscular frame moving with the practiced efficiency of a predator. "Transport's ready," he grunted, his accent thick but his English precise. "But we're still one short. You said we needed a medic." "I'm here," came a soft voice from the doorway. Leor Pasternak stepped into the observation deck, medical pack slung over one shoulder. The Israeli field surgeon had worked in 3 different war zones before the dead started walking, and his gentle demeanor masked the core of tempered steel. "Though I question the wisdom of this entire endeavor, I won't let you go without medical support." His eyes, dark and thoughtful behind wire-rimmed glasses, met Tavian's. "My daughter was in the zone when the walls went up. If there's any chance she's still out there, still human. I have to know." Tavian felt the weight of responsibility settle heavier on his shoulders. Each person joining this mission carried their own demons, their own desperate need for answers. He'd assembled this team carefully, each member possessed skills essential for survival beyond the wall, but more importantly, each had been personally wronged by the Council's policy of information suppression and strategic abandonment. The 5th member of their group arrived in a whir of electronic equipment. Corinne Sato pushed a cart loaded with communication gear, satellite uplinks, and devices whose purposes Tavian could only guess at. The young Japanese tech specialist had been a corporate hacker before the outbreak, his skills in digital infiltration now repurposed for humanity's survival. "I've bypassed the security protocols on the eastern gate," Corinne announced, his fingers dancing across a portable keyboard. "We'll have a 47-minute window before the automated systems register the breach and alert the Council." 47 minutes, Marek repeated, checking his watch. Tight, but doable. Tavian looked at each of them in turn, Esh with her scientific determination, Marek with his warrior's readiness, Leor with his quiet desperation, and Corinne with his nervous energy. They were an unlikely group bound together by a common purpose, to uncover what really happened at Moretti Research, To understand why the dead rose and the living fell, and perhaps most importantly, to learn what the World Recovery Council was so desperately trying to hide. Once we cross that threshold, there's no guarantee we'll make it back, Tavian warned them. The zone isn't just infected territory, it's where the rules of the old world went to die. Ash managed a grim smile. The old world died everywhere, Tavian. We're just going to look at its corpse more closely. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the fortified haven, the five of them gathered their gear and headed toward the eastern gate. Behind them lay safety, routine, and comfortable ignorance. Ahead lay the truth, purchased at a price they couldn't yet calculate. The quarantine zone waited, patient as the grave, ready to reveal its secrets to those brave or foolish enough to seek them. The eastern gate opened with a mechanical groan that seemed to echo across the wasteland like a death knell. Tavian felt the change immediately as they stepped through. The air tasted different on this side of the wall, thick with decay and the peculiar chemical tang of decomposition accelerated by the Moretti virus. The gate sealed behind them with a finality that made Corinne flinch, his fingers tightening on the strap of his equipment bag. They stood in the decontamination corridor, 100-meter stretch of cracked asphalt flanked by abandoned guard towers, watching as the outer barrier slowly cranked open before them. "Welcome to hell," Marek muttered, shouldering his rifle as the quarantine zone revealed itself in full. The landscape that stretched before them had once been the thriving suburb of Millerton Valley, population 42,000. Now it resembled a photograph left too long in harsh sunlight, faded, warped, wrong. Houses slumped like tired old men, their windows dark and broken. Vehicles sat rusted in driveways, doors hanging open where owners had fled in panic. Vegetation had begun reclaiming the streets, vines crawling up telephone poles and through broken windows, but even the plants seemed diseased here, their leaves mottled with strange black spots. Ash immediately pulled out her atmospheric scanner, frowning at the readings. Particulate density is 3 times higher than council reports indicated. There are biological compounds in the air that shouldn't exist, proteins that don't match any known organism. She looked up, her expression troubled. They've been lying about the environmental data. This isn't just a virus that reanimates corpses. It's changing the entire ecosystem. "Stay sharp," Tavian ordered, drawing his handgun. The weight of it felt reassuring in his palm. "Sound discipline from here on. We don't know what the noise threshold is for attracting them." They moved in a tactical formation Marek had drilled into them during their week of preparation, a diamond pattern with the veteran soldier on point, Tavian and Esh on the flanks, Corinne protected in the center, and Lior covering their rear. Their footsteps seemed impossibly loud despite their caution, every crunch of debris underfoot making Tavian's nerves sing with tension. The first body appeared 50 meters from the gate. It lay sprawled across the hood of a sedan, dried blood painting abstract patterns on sun-bleached metal. Unlike the infected they'd seen in council footage, this corpse looked wrong. Tumorous growths bulged from its back and arms, crystalline structures that caught the light with an oily iridescence. Ash immediately moved to examine it, pulling on latex gloves with practiced efficiency. "Don't touch it," Lior warned. "We don't know if the virus can transmit through dead tissue." "That's exactly why I need to examine it," Ash countered, carefully extracting a tissue sample and sealing it in a containment vial. "These growths, I've never seen anything like this in any of the Council's research data. This is advanced mutation, possibly 3rd or 4th generation." A sound froze them all in place, a wet, dragging shuffle from somewhere between the houses to their left. Marek's hand came up in a closed fist, the universal signal to halt and take cover. They scattered silently, each finding concealment behind abandoned vehicles or crumbling walls. Tavian pressed himself against the brick facade of what had once been a coffee shop, his heart hammering against his ribs. The infected emerged from between 2 colonial-style homes, and Tavian felt his breath catch in his throat. The council's propaganda had shown shambling corpses, mindless and slow, threats only in overwhelming numbers. This thing moved with disturbing purpose, its head swiveling as if genuinely searching. The same crystalline growths covered its torso, and one arm had transformed into something that resembled a blade more than a limb. Fresh blood stained its mouth. Something had died recently, and this creature had fed. It paused in the middle of the street, tilting its head in a gesture that struck Tavian as almost bird-like in its alien quality. For a terrible moment, he thought it was looking directly at him, that its clouded eyes had somehow pierced his hiding spot. Then Corinne's equipment bag shifted with an electronic beep, barely audible to human ears, but the infected's head snapped toward the sound with predatory precision. Marek's rifle coughed twice, suppressed shots that nonetheless seemed loud as thunderclaps in the oppressive silence. The infected dropped, the back of its skull blown open, crystalline growths shattering like diseased ice. But the damage was done. From deeper in the suburb, answering calls rang out, moans and shrieks that spoke of hunger and rage and something worse than death. "Run," Tavian commanded, and they ran. They sprinted through streets lined with memories of ordinary life, a child's bicycle lying in a yard, a garden gnome grinning emptily from a porch, a flagpole flying tattered remnants of the national colors. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, multiplied, became a chorus of the damned. Tavian risked a glance backward and immediately wished he hadn't. At least 15 infected had emerged from houses and alleys, their movements disturbingly coordinated as they gave chase. "There!" Leor shouted, pointing toward a 2-story building with intact windows and a steel-reinforced door, an old bank branch. They altered course, feet pounding pavement, lungs burning. Corinne stumbled, and Marek caught him without breaking stride, half carrying the smaller man the last 20 meters. Tavian reached the door first, finding it locked. "Corinne." The tech specialist's fingers flew across his portable decoder, sweat streaming down his face. 10 seconds. "We don't have 10 seconds. Esh fired her pistol past Tavian's shoulder, dropping an infected that had gotten too close. The rest of the horde was only meters away now, close enough that Tavian could see the terrible intelligence burning in some of their eyes, could smell the sweet rot stench rolling off them in waves. The lock clicked. They piled through the doorway, and Marek slammed it shut behind them, throwing the deadbolt just as bodies crashed against the other side. The door shuddered but held. The infected clawed at the steel, their moans vibrating through the metal, but they couldn't breach it. Inside the dim bank lobby, the 5 survivors stood gasping, hearts racing, the reality of their situation crashing down on them like a physical weight. They'd been beyond the wall for less than an hour, and they'd already nearly died. "This is worse than we thought," Tavian said quietly, and no one disagreed. The infected continued their assault on the bank's exterior for another 20 minutes before gradually dispersing, their moans fading into the ambient horror of the quarantine zone. Tavian posted Marek at the front door to maintain watch while the others explored their temporary sanctuary. The bank had been stripped of anything obviously valuable, the vault stood open and empty, filing cabinets hung ajar with papers scattered across the floor, but the structure itself remained sound, and more importantly, defensible. Esh set up a makeshift laboratory in what had been the branch manager's office, spreading her collection equipment across an oak desk marked with coffee rings and the mundane debris of interrupted life. A photograph lay face up among the papers, a smiling woman with 2 young children, frozen forever in a moment of happiness that seemed obscene in its contrast to the present reality. Tavian watched the scientist work, her movements precise despite the tremor in her hands, the aftermath of adrenaline. "Those mutations you mentioned," he said quietly, not wanting to disturb her concentration. "How far beyond the Council's reports are we talking?" Esh didn't look up from her microscope, a portable unit Corinne had modified to run on battery power. "The samples I collected showed genetic drift that should take years, possibly decades. The Moretti virus isn't just reanimating dead tissue, it's actively rewriting genetic code, experimenting with different forms." She finally met his eyes, and the fear there was more eloquent than any words. "Tavian, viruses don't behave like this naturally. The Council's official story is that Moretti Research was developing a regenerative therapy that mutated accidentally. But this level of complexity, this purposeful evolution, this was designed." The implications hung in the air between them like poison gas. Before Tavian could respond, Corinne called out from the lobby, his voice sharp with excitement or alarm, it was hard to tell which. You need to see this. Right now. They gathered around Corinne's portable terminal, which he'd connected to something behind the bank's teller station. Lines of code scrolled across his screen, interspersed with corrupted video files and data packets that made no sense to Tavian's untrained eye. The bank had a local server backup system, completely isolated from the main grid, Corinne explained, his fingers dancing across keys. It's been recording security footage this entire time, running on emergency power until the batteries finally died about 6 months ago. But the stored data is intact. He pulled up a video file dated 3 years prior, 2 days after the official start of the outbreak. The grainy security footage showed the street outside the bank, the same street they'd just fled through. But instead of a ghost town, it bustled with panic, people running, screaming, being pulled down by the infected. Standard outbreak chaos, the kind of footage the council had shown countless times to justify the quarantine protocols. Then the timestamp jumped forward by 4 hours, and everything changed. Military vehicles rolled down the street, but they weren't evacuating survivors. Soldiers in hazmat suits systematically moved through the area, checking bodies, pulling some aside. But what made Tavian's blood run cold was what they did next. They were injecting the corpses with something. Within minutes, the dead began to rise, fresher and more aggressive than they'd been before. Dios mío, Leor whispered, his face pale. They're not fighting the infection. They're spreading it. Keep watching, Corinne said grimly, advancing the footage. The timestamp showed the following day, and now different vehicles appeared, civilian trucks with the Moretti Research logo. Scientists in protective gear collected samples from the infected, made notations, took photographs like tourists documenting an attraction. One scientist stood apart from the others, a tall woman with distinctive silver hair who seemed to be directing the operation. Corinne zoomed in on her face and ran it through a recognition program he'd hacked from the council database weeks ago. The match came back immediately, Dr. Valina Moretti herself, the brilliant geneticist who'd supposedly died when the outbreak began, patient 0 according to official records. Yet here she was, 2 days after her reported death, very much alive and overseeing what could only be described as a field experiment. This is impossible, Esh breathed, but her eyes told a different story, the pieces of a terrible puzzle falling into place. Unless the entire outbreak was deliberate from the start. Not an accident, not a mistake, but a controlled release. Tavian felt reality shifting beneath his feet, the foundations of everything he'd believed crumbling. The quarantine zone wasn't a tragedy, it was a laboratory. The millions of dead and infected weren't victims of a disaster but subjects in an experiment. And the World Recovery Council, the governing body that claimed to be desperately searching for a cure, had known all along. We need to reach the Moretti campus, he said, his voice hard as iron. If Dr. Moretti is alive, if this was intentional, there has to be documentation, proof we can take back to expose what's really happening. Assuming we can get back, Moret called from his position at the door. The veteran soldier hadn't turned away from his watch, but his shoulders were tight with tension. That footage changes nothing about our situation. We're still trapped in a zone full of monsters, 30 kilometers from our target, with limited ammunition and supplies. As if to emphasize his point, a scream echoed through the desolate streets, human, terrified, and shockingly close. They all froze, instinctively holding their breath as the sound came again, words barely distinguishable through raw panic. Help! Please, someone help me! Tavian moved to the window, carefully peering through a gap in the blinds. A figure sprinted down the street, a young woman, perhaps 25, her clothes torn and bloody, dark hair streaming behind her as she fled from 3 infected that pursued with terrible determination. She stumbled, caught herself, ran on, but she was slowing with exhaustion and terror. In seconds, the infected would overtake her. We can't, Leor said, reading Tavian's expression. We open that door, we risk everything. We don't know who she is, if she's even uninfected. We can't just watch her die, Tavian countered, already moving toward the entrance. Marek, covering fire. Leor, be ready with your medical kit. Everyone else, stay inside. You're a fool, Marek said, but he was already unlocking the door, bringing his rifle up to a firing position. A noble fool, but still a fool. The door swung open, and Tavian's voice cut through the afternoon air like a blade. "Here! This way!" The woman's head snapped toward them, hope blazing in her eyes for a brief, beautiful moment. She altered course, finding some reserve of strength to push herself faster. The infected followed, their attention now divided between their fleeing prey and this new source of noise and movement. Marek's rifle spoke 3 times, 3 precise shots, and 2 infected dropped instantly. The third took a round through the shoulder that spun it around but didn't stop it. The creature recovered faster than anything dead should have been able to, orienting on the bank entrance with frightening focus. The woman reached them first, practically falling through the doorway into Lior's ready arms. The infected was only meters behind, but Tavian stood his ground, aimed carefully, and put a bullet through its forehead. It collapsed in a heap of corrupted flesh, the crystalline growths across its body already beginning to sublimate, releasing thin streams of vapor that reeked of ammonia and decay. They sealed the door again, and silence descended like a curtain. The woman they'd saved sat on the floor, chest heaving, eyes wide with shock and exhaustion. She looked up at her rescuers, and when she spoke, her voice carried an accent Tavian couldn't quite place, Eastern European, perhaps, or Russian. "Thank you," she gasped. "Thank you, I thought I was dead." "You nearly were," Lior said gently, beginning to examine her injuries. "I'm Lior, a medic. These wounds need to be cleaned." "Were you bitten?" "No, just scratches from running through debris. I've been so careful to avoid them." She looked at each of them in turn, and Tavian saw intelligence spark through the trauma in her eyes. "My name is Zaina Volkov. And you shouldn't be here. No one should be here. Don't you know what this place really is?" Marek, who'd returned to his position at the window, went rigid at the sound of her surname. He turned slowly, his scarred face draining of color. "Volkov? Zaina Volkov?" His voice came out strangled. "From Sector 12, before the walls?" The woman's eyes widened in recognition. "Uncle Marek?" The reunion that followed was both joyful and heartbreaking, Marek embracing his niece whom he'd thought dead for 3 years, Zaina weeping against her uncle's chest, both of them speaking rapidly in Russian. The rest of the team gave them privacy, stepping back, but Tavian watched the soldier's face transform from its usual stoic mask into something vulnerable and human. When they finally separated, Zaina wiped her eyes and addressed the group, her voice steadier now, edged with urgency. "I've been surviving in the zone for 3 years. I've seen things, learned things that the Council doesn't want anyone to know. If you're here looking for answers, I can guide you. But we need to move soon. When the sun sets, the night breed emerge. And they're far worse than anything you've encountered so far." Tavian glanced out the window at the afternoon sun, already beginning its descent toward the horizon. They had perhaps 3 hours of daylight remaining. 3 hours to decide whether to trust this unexpected ally, to plan their next move, to prepare for whatever horrors the darkness might bring. "Tell us everything," he said. "Starting with what you mean by nightbreed." Zaina's expression grew grave. "First-generation infected, the ones still capable of learning, of hunting with strategy. They avoid sunlight, not because it hurts them, but because they've learned that darkness gives them advantage. Dr. Moretti's greatest success and humanity's worst nightmare." She looked at each of them with eyes that had seen too much. "You wanted to know the truth about the outbreak? The truth is that we're not fighting a plague. We're fighting an army. And the war was lost before it even began." Night fell over the quarantine zone like a predator's shadow, swift and absolute. Tavian watched from the bank's second-floor window as the street below transformed into something from nightmare, shadows that moved with purpose, shapes that didn't quite resolve into anything human despite their origins. The night breed, as Zaina had called them, emerged from buildings and sewers, from beneath overturned vehicles and out of storm drains. They moved in coordinated patterns, small groups that communicated through clicks and low, thrumming vocalizations that made his teeth ache. Behind him, Zaina spread a hand-drawn map across a desk, her fingers tracing routes through the devastated suburbs toward their ultimate destination. She'd cleaned up somewhat, her wounds bandaged by Lior's practiced hands, her face still bearing the marks of 3 years' survival but alive with fierce determination. Marek hadn't left her side, his protective instincts fully engaged now that he'd found family he'd thought forever lost. The Moretti campus is here, Zaina indicated a cluster of buildings roughly 30 kilometers northeast of their current position. But the direct route is suicide. The infection density increases exponentially as you approach ground zero. You'd be overwhelmed within hours. Her finger traced an alternate path, looping north through what looked like industrial districts and commercial zones. This route is longer, maybe 50 kilometers total, but it passes through areas the Nightbreed tend to avoid. Why would they avoid any area? Esh asked, leaning closer to study the map. The scientist had been interrogating Zaina for the past hour, extracting every scrap of observational data the survivor had gathered. If they're as intelligent as you suggest, wouldn't they want to control the entire zone? They do control it, Zaina corrected. But there are places even they won't enter, or enter only in large numbers. Sectors where the virus mutated in unexpected ways, where the infected become something else entirely. She pointed to several areas marked with dark X's on her map. Dead zones, we call them. Places where nothing living or dead survives for long. Corinne looked up from his terminal, where he'd been reviewing more of the bank's archived security footage. I found something else. 3 months after the initial outbreak, there were helicopters, military and Moretti research, making regular flights along a specific corridor. He projected the flight paths onto his screen, and they matched perfectly with Zaina's safe route. They knew where to fly to avoid the worst infected concentrations. Because they created those concentrations, Tavian said bitterly. The evidence was mounting into an undeniable picture of deliberate atrocity. They've been managing the zone like a wildlife preserve, maintaining the infected populations, studying them, refining the virus. Lior had been silent for most of the planning session, his attention focused on reviewing medical supplies and preparing field dressings. Now he spoke, his voice quiet but carrying clearly. To what end? What could possibly justify this? Millions dead, civilization brought to its knees, survivors trapped in havens that are little better than prisons, for what purpose? That's what we need to find out, Tavian replied. And the only place we'll get answers is the source. Zaina, you've survived here for 3 years. Will you guide us? She met his eyes steadily, and he saw the weight of those years reflected there, the loneliness, the terror, the soul-deep exhaustion of constant survival. But beneath that, something else burned, purpose, anger, the need for justice or revenge or perhaps just understanding. I'll guide you, she said. But not just to the campus. There's something else you need to see first, something that will help you understand the scope of what Moretti created. She pointed to a location marked on her map with a red circle, perhaps 10 kilometers from their current position. The congregation, she said, and even speaking the words seemed to cost her something. It's where the Nightbreed gather during the day, where they... I don't even know how to describe it. You need to see it to believe it. How dangerous? Marek asked, his tactical mind already working through scenarios. Very. But manageable if we're careful and move during the day when they're dormant. And if you want to understand what we're really fighting, what Moretti really created, you need to witness the congregation. Zaina's expression was haunted. I've been there 3 times. Each time, I understood a little more. And each time, I wished I hadn't. They debated through the night, weighing risks against the value of knowledge, survival against truth. The Nightbreed patrolled the streets outside, their inhuman communications creating a discordant symphony that prevented any thought of sleep. Corinne monitored their patterns on his motion sensors, noting with growing unease how organized the infected seemed, how their patrols covered every possible approach to the bank. They know we're in here, the tech specialist said nervously. They're not trying to break in, but they're definitely watching the building. They're learning, Esh mused, studying the patrol patterns on Corinne's screen. adapting their behavior based on previous encounters. The ones who successfully trapped prey passed on that knowledge somehow. This isn't possible with standard viral reanimation. There's no mechanism for information transfer between infected individuals. Unless that mechanism was engineered into them, Zaina said. I've watched Nightbreed communicate complex information. Locations of survivors, weak points and defenses, even crude tools and weapons. Whatever Moretti did, she didn't just create a virus that raises the dead. She created something that evolves, that thinks, that organizes. Dawn came slowly, the darkness reluctant to release its grip on the quarantine zone. As the first gray light touched the horizon, the Nightbreed began to withdraw, retreating to whatever dark places sheltered them during daylight hours. The street outside gradually emptied until it resembled the ghost town it had appeared to be when they first entered, lifeless, abandoned, safe only in appearance. We move now, Tavian decided. Fast and quiet. Zaina's route to the congregation, then we'll reassess. They gathered their equipment, checking weapons and supplies with the thoroughness of people who understood that survival balanced on such details. Lior distributed energy bars and water, ensuring everyone maintained their strength. Esh secured her samples and equipment, unwilling to leave behind any data they'd collected. Corinne backed up his files to 3 separate drives, paranoid about losing the evidence they were accumulating. Marek conducted a final weapons check, his movements economical and precise. At the door, Tavian paused, looking back at the bank that had sheltered them through the night. Once we leave, we're committed. No safe haven between here and the congregation. There's no safe haven anywhere in the zone, Zaina replied. You learn that first, or you die. Come on, we have maybe 12 hours of relative safety before the Nightbreed hunt again. They emerged into the morning, the air thick with moisture and decay. The infected they'd killed the previous day had already begun to decompose, the virus consuming their remaining tissues from the inside out, leaving behind only crystalline structures that gleamed wetly in the dim light. Esh paused to photograph them, documenting every aspect of the mutation, building a catalog of evidence that the council could never refute. The journey through the suburbs was a study in controlled terror. They moved from cover to cover, avoiding open spaces, staying away from buildings that might harbor dormant infected. Zaina proved herself an expert guide, leading them along paths she'd clearly traveled many times, pointing out dangers before they became threats, tripwires left by other survivors, deadfalls created by structural collapse, sinkholes where streets had given way to the tunnels below. There are others? Lior asked when she mentioned survivors. People living in the zone? A few, Zaina replied. Maybe 100 spread across the entire quarantine territory. We avoid each other mostly, resources are scarce, and trust is scarcer. Some have gone feral, as dangerous as the infected in their own way. Others just want to be left alone to survive another day. Why did you stay? Tavian asked. 3 years, you could have tried to reach the walls, signal for extraction. Zaina's laugh was bitter. And tell them what? That their quarantine is a lie, that the council is complicit in genocide? They'd either ignore me or silence me permanently. No, the only way to expose this is with undeniable proof. I've been gathering evidence, documenting everything, but I had no way to get it out. She glanced at Corinne's equipment-laden backpack. Until now. Your communication gear, if we can reach a high enough transmission point, can you breach the council's information lockdown? Maybe, Corinne said thoughtfully. If I can hijack a satellite uplink, piggyback on military frequencies, yes, I could broadcast directly to the havens, bypass the council's censorship entirely. Then we have 2 objectives, Tavian said. Document the truth at the Moretti campus, and find a transmission point strong enough to send that truth to everyone who needs to hear it. They continued through the ruins of civilization, each step taking them deeper into the zone's heart. The suburbs gave way to commercial districts, shopping centers with shattered windows displaying mannequins that looked disturbingly like corpses, parking lots filled with cars that would never move again. Here the signs of violence were more apparent, bullet holes stitching walls, blast craters in pavement, entire buildings burned to skeletal frameworks. The military had fought hard to contain the outbreak in these areas before falling back to establish the quarantine perimeter. It was approaching noon when Zaina led them to a rise overlooking a vast amphitheater, one of those modern concert venues that had proliferated before the collapse. She gestured for silence, for them to stay low, and they crept forward to peer down at what lay below. The congregation defied comprehension. Thousands of infected filled the amphitheater, packed together in concentric circles that spiraled inward toward a central stage. They stood motionless, perfectly still, their heads all angled toward the center where a single figure stood, a nightbreed unlike any other, its body covered in the crystalline growths but arranged in patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost decorative. And as they watched, it began to vocalize, a complex series of sounds that the other infected echoed in waves, creating a rhythm that was horrifyingly close to music. "Dear God," Esh whispered. "They're communicating. Complex information transfer through sound patterns. It's like language." "It is language," Zaina confirmed grimly. "They're teaching each other. Passing on knowledge about hunting techniques, danger identification, even tool use. I've watched them for hours. The Nightbreed aren't just infected humans anymore. They're becoming something new. Something that might one day surpass us." Tavian felt the foundation of his understanding crack further. This wasn't just a plague, wasn't just a biological weapon. This was transformation, evolution compressed into years instead of millennia. Moretti hadn't simply created a virus, she'd created the mechanism for humanity's replacement. "We've seen enough," he said, his voice shaking despite his efforts at control. "We need to reach the campus, find out why she did this. Because there has to be a reason. Has to be something that explains." He trailed off, unable to articulate the enormity of what they were witnessing. As they carefully withdrew from the overlook, none of them noticed the single Nightbreed that had separated from the congregation, its clouded eyes tracking their movement with unnerving focus. It didn't cry out or alert the others. It simply watched them go, committing their appearance to whatever passed for memory in its transformed brain. The hunt had begun, but this time, the infected were the hunters who could plan, could anticipate, could learn from their prey's tactics. And in the quarantine zone, learning was survival, and survival meant everything.